Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast features 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called 27 Years, and it involves a motion detector picking up something very strange at a summer camp. The second story you'll hear is called Guardian Angel, and it's about a strange set of circumstances. Just after midnight on April 4th, 2013, a man stepped out of his tent into the pitch-black woods of central Maine. He was wearing a wool hat, he had a nice brand new Columbia jacket on, some Land's End jeans, and some high-quality boots. He was carrying a backpack as well as another bag that contained a screwdriver along with some other tools. He adjusted his glasses and then looked up into the sky, and it was so dark he couldn't even see the moon, and he thought to himself, perfect. He turned and began quickly walking away from his tent into this forest where the trees were so dense that if you weren't careful, you could actually get stuck in between 2 trees. And scattered all over the ground were these huge slippery boulders covered in moss where one wrong step and you're breaking an ankle. But despite the rugged terrain and 0 visibility, this man was able to easily navigate this area as if he had memorized every step. After an hour of silent hiking, he reached this huge pond called North Pond, and while staying hidden in the trees, he followed the shoreline until he reached the edge of the forest overlooking this clearing. And right in front of him were dozens of cabins overlooking this pond. This was Pine Tree Summer Camp. He waited in the tree line for a few minutes just listening to make sure nobody was out there, even though he knew their schedule and knew no one was there. After not hearing anything and feeling like the coast was clear, he stepped out of the woods and walked up to the top of the camp to the dining hall, and he made his way around to the back door. There, he pulled a screwdriver out of his bag and expertly popped open the lock and stepped inside. Once he was inside, he pulled out his tiny flashlight and he made his way over to the pantry where he began stuffing his bag full of candy, chips, and coffee. Once his bag was almost completely full, he walked over to the walk-in freezer, he went into his pocket and pulled out a key that he had stolen on a previous trip. He unlocked the lock, went inside, he grabbed some frozen hamburger patties and hot dogs, and then he left the freezer and locked it behind him. He did one more pass through the pantry and grabbed some more candy off the shelves and jammed them into his pockets, and then after feeling satisfied that he had all he could take, he decided it was time to leave. And so as he made his way to the door, he thought to himself, great, another successful raid complete. Or so he thought. A motion detector had recently been installed inside of the dining hall behind the ice machine. As soon as this man had pried open the back door, it had picked him up and remained silent, but sent an alarm to the nearby home of Sergeant Terry Hughes, who was a game warden that was investigating recent thefts in the area. Terry sped to the camp in under 4 minutes, and he parked his truck a ways away from the dining hall because he was worried he would scare off the perpetrator. So he parked his car and ran on foot, staying in the tree line until he got right behind the dining hall. He ran up to the back door and looked in the window, and he saw this tall, skinny man walking out of the walk-in freezer. And this guy did not look towards Terry. Instead, he turned and walked farther away from him over towards the pantry. This guy pulls a flashlight out, he shines it at one of the shelves, and he takes some things off the shelf and puts them in his pockets. And then after standing there for a minute, the man turns off his flashlight, faces Terry, and begins walking towards the back door. At this point, Terry backs off the window and goes behind a tree that's overlooking the back door. He gets his flashlight in one hand and he unholsters his pistol and he waits. Terry watched as this man barely opened the back door. He slinked out the crack and then he began walking into the woods. And at that point, Terry leapt out, shined the light in his face, drew his pistol and told him to get on the ground. The man didn't resist. He immediately got on the ground, and Terry called the state police, who were there only a couple minutes later. They arrested this guy and put him on a chair, and then they began interviewing him. They asked him what his name was, and the man just remained silent. And so they searched him, but they couldn't find any form of identification. And so they asked him again, what's your name? And the guy again didn't say anything. So the officers decided to remove his handcuffs and give him a bottle of water and then see if he would talk. And sure enough, he did. His speech was slow and awkward and kind of abrupt, like he had not spoken in a really long time. He told them his name was Christopher Knight and that he had been born on December 7th, 1965. He said he didn't have an address, he didn't have a vehicle, and he had never filed a tax return. He told them he lived in a tent in the woods nearby. They asked him how long he had been doing that for, and he paused for a minute and then said, when was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster? And the officers looked at each other and they were like, 1986. And he's like, yeah, that's when I went in the woods. And they were like, that was 27 years ago. And Chris said, yeah. The officers asked him, well, 27 years is a long time. You gotta be out there with some other people. Is your family out here? You got a girlfriend? You got, some sort of companion out there with you? And Chris said, no, I live out there alone. And in fact, the last time I had a conversation with another person besides now was in 1990 when I happened to walk past another hiker and we both just said hi to each other. Besides that, for 27 years, it's just been me. And it would turn out Chris wasn't kidding, and he went to great lengths to ensure he stayed completely cut off from the rest of society. Despite winter temperatures dropping to negative 20 degrees, he refused to light a fire in fear of giving away his camp. And so instead, when it got that cold, he would just stay up all night pacing around his camp, trying to stay warm that way. He never even talked to himself or sang out loud because he was so worried someone might hear him, and he never left his campsite unless it was basically pitch black on an overcast night because he was afraid of being seen. When the officers asked him if he had access to the internet at least, he said, I haven't seen the internet. Chris wound up confessing to over 1,000 burglaries over the 27 years he had been out in the woods. He said he was ashamed of it, but originally when he had moved out into the woods, he had tried to hunt for his own food and forage for his own food, but he was terrible at it, so he had to resort to theft. He said he only robbed cabins and homes when he was certain no one was there, which meant sometimes going a long period of time between meals. And the food he did find made for a terrible diet. He mostly ate junk food and candy because it was stuff that was easy to find and kept fairly well. When asked why he had moved into the woods in the first place, he didn't really have an answer. Although in a later interview, he would say that growing up, human interaction had always been very difficult for him, and when he was in the woods, he just felt kind of content and at peace. When Chris's story broke, the residents around North Pond were shocked. For decades, they had swapped stories about someone or something haunting the area. Propane tanks, food, batteries, clothes, books would all go missing. They were starting to get scared, especially when it was overcast at night, because they knew that was when this person would come out. But despite staying up at night with their weapons out ready to confront whoever it was doing this, they never found him. And the police were repeatedly called to come in and try to solve this mystery, but they couldn't figure it out either. As the incidents mounted, the Phantom was given a name, the North Pond Hermit. When Chris was finally arrested and some of his life story was leaked to the media, residents of North Pond were torn on how to feel about him. Some people thought he was purely a criminal, that he was a thief, and that not only had he stolen their physical property, he'd also stolen their peace of mind and their sanity. Others idolized him like he was some cult hero. He was a man that rejected what society says makes us happy: careers, relationships, material comforts, yet he was happy. But regardless of how residents felt about his lifestyle, the one thing they could all agree on was how incredible it was that he survived for as long as he did. Winters in Maine are notoriously brutal and cold. A week of winter camping would be considered a huge accomplishment, let alone an entire season. That was totally unheard of, and Chris did entire seasons 27 years in a row. Ultimately, Chris was sentenced to 7 months in prison. When he was released, he was given 3 years of probation, and part of the conditions for his release is that every week he would have to go physically check in with the judge, which meant he would not be able to just escape back into the woods again. When his probation did finally end, he did not go running back into the woods. He decided to remain in society. In an interview, Christopher was asked what he learned from these 27 years in total isolation. What have you learned about the human experience? What did you learn about yourself? Tell us, because you have knowledge that virtually none of us will ever have access to. And apparently he just paused, thought about it for a second, and then looked up at the interviewer and said, "Make sure you get enough sleep." And then he got up and walked away. While we don't know exactly what Chris is up to these days, people that know him say he lives by himself in a small apartment, he has a regular job, and he values his privacy over everything else. Our next story is called Guardian Angel. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong. And he said, you know what? You probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave. And so Deborah said, yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream. And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed. She's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now. And her husband did not want to go. And he said, come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal. But she was adamant. She said, get out of bed. We're leaving right now. And so begrudgingly, her husband said, okay, we'll leave right now. And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence. And then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal, and at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it, and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it, and she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road. And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her. But Deborah at this point is now terrified and she's saying, no, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her. And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up and they tell them to drive back up the road but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road. The police came up on their side and they said, yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side. And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight. And then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn. And so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road and they stopped next to Deborah's car and they said, you know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary. And Deborah would say to police, I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there. And they would tell her that we believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there. And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over, he's intrigued, and he asks them, what happened? What did you see? And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend. And when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her, and then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But, according to the coroner, that would have been impossible, because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact, 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bully and Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle-of-the-night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Missing Patients. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old father of 6 named Tatike Katsai arrived at a hospital in Stellenbosch, which is one of the richest towns in South Africa. Tatike, who lived in the area with his family, had been dealing with some stomach issues over the last several months, and so this day he was finally going in to have abdominal surgery to hopefully alleviate those issues. So, after entering the building, Tatike was checked in, and then before long he was transferred to the operating room where surgeons got to work on him. After the surgery was over, Tatike was transferred to a recovery room in the hospital where he was scheduled to stay for at least a couple of days so the doctors and nurses could watch over him while he recovered and make sure there was no complications from the procedure. And so, on the afternoon of October 4th, Tatike just kind of lounged around inside of his recovery room. He couldn't really do anything because of the incisions on his stomach, and so he mostly just laid in his bed, he watched TV, he relaxed, he ate, and then at some point, some of his family members came into the hospital and they visited with him as well. By the end of that day, the day of his surgery, Tatike was definitely sore from the incisions, but overall, he was in good spirits, and to the medical staff, it seemed very likely that his surgery was a success. Early the next morning, at around 5:15 a.m., one of the nurses in the hospital went to Tatike's room to check on him. And when she went inside, Tatike was awake, he was alert, he seemed totally normal. And so after a brief conversation, the nurse told Tatike that she was just going to get him some fresh linens to make up his bed. And so Tatike nodded a thank you to her, and then the nurse, she turned away from Tatike, who's in his bed. She stepped out of the one door in the room into the hallway, she grabbed fresh linens off of a cart, and then she turned back around and went back into Tatike's room, except now Tatike was not in his bed. So the nurse immediately thought, okay, well then Tatike must have gone into his bathroom because the door was shut. He must be in the bathroom. And so just kind of reflexively, the nurse walked over to Tatike's now empty bed and replaced the linens. And then when she was done, she just looked at the bathroom door inside of his room, expecting Tatike to come outside any minute. But after a couple of minutes passed and Tatike had still not come out of the bathroom, the nurse decided to go over and just knock. And so she walked over, she knocked on the bathroom door and just kind of called out, "Hey, is everything okay in there?" But there was no answer. And so the nurse eventually just tried the handle, and when she saw it was open, she called out that she was coming inside, she opened up the bathroom door, and it was empty. And so the nurse, she whipped her head around and looked back out at the room where Tatike should have been. And she saw, he's not on the bed, he's not under the bed, he's not anywhere in this room. Where could he have possibly gone? And she's thinking to herself, the only door out of this room is into the hallway, the same door that she had used to go out and get the linens. And if somehow Tatike had ran out of that door in the few seconds that her back was turned from Tatike, she certainly would have heard him or seen him. Because again, she was right outside the door and only outside of his room for a couple of seconds. Not to mention the fact, Tatike has major incisions on his stomach and could barely stand, let alone walk or run. And so totally baffled, this nurse ultimately left the room and went and told her superiors. This hospital would immediately begin looking for Tatike on the grounds of the hospital, but they would do it kind of quietly. They wouldn't call Tatike's family to tell them that, hey, we can't find him, nor would they call police. And some have speculated that either one, the hospital did not think this was an emergency and they would quickly find Tatike and that everything would be fine, or two, the hospital was just so embarrassed at the idea that they lost a patient, they didn't want anyone to know, and so that's why they didn't tell anyone. Regardless, the hospital would search for Tatike all day on the 5th, the day he went missing, and they wouldn't find him. And then the next day, the 6th, the hospital again would spend the entire day quietly searching everywhere in the hospital, but they wouldn't find him again. And so finally on the next day, the 7th, so 48 hours after Tatike had just kind of vanished inside of his room, the hospital would reach out to Tatike's family and they would say to them, "Hey, is Tatike home with you guys?" And the family was like, "No, he's supposed to be with you." And so the hospital would say, "Well, he left 2 days ago, so we don't know where he is." And so Tatike's family is horrified, not only that they were totally left in the dark, but they would find out over the course of this conversation that the hospital had not even contacted the police yet. And so the family, they reached out to the police, and then later that day, the family would meet the police at the Stellenbosch hospital, and then a very public search of the property would ensue to look for Tatike. However, again, no one could find him. Authorities would continue to search both the hospital and also the neighboring area outside of the hospital over the next couple of days, but after they continued to find absolutely nothing, the search began to wind down. And so Tatike's devastated family was left with absolutely no idea what to think or what to do. Fast forward to October 20th, so 15 days after Tatike had gone missing. And on this day, the 20th, there was a construction crew at this hospital in Stellenbosch doing some renovations. And at some point on this day, one of the workers had to climb into the ceiling of one of the floors of this hospital. Now, the space above the ceiling is this tight, cramped space, almost like an attic. It's very big and wide. It's like the whole length of that floor. And really the only people that would ever go into the ceiling are construction workers or other authorized personnel that needed to do work. It's not a place that the public would ever go into. But when one of these workers went up into the ceiling, he had a headlamp on and he's kind of looking around. He's looking for what he needs to do up there. And at some point he turns his head and his light illuminates a person sitting in the corner far away from him, way up against the side in this tiny little attic space. And it would turn out it was Tatike and he was deceased. The hospital had absolutely no clue how Tatike could have gotten up there. Not only is it obviously not a publicly accessible area, but the actual way to get up into the ceiling, the door that leads up into the ceiling, is very difficult to find. And even if Tatike found this entrance into the ceiling, it would have been nearly impossible for him to actually get into the ceiling. Because again, this guy has serious incisions on his stomach from the surgery he got. He could barely sit up. He couldn't really walk. So the idea of him climbing and pulling himself up into the ceiling just seems impossible. Then there was the very strange autopsy results. Now, the full report has not been made public, but Tatike's family had a consultation with the hospital after the autopsy was complete, and they would go to reporters and talk about what the hospital told them. And apparently, the hospital told the family that Tatike did not die from complications from his surgery, and they heavily insinuated that Tatike did not die from natural causes. Something happened to him, and the hospital had no idea what this something was, and that's what killed him. And the hospital also told the family that Tatike likely was dead before he went up into the ceiling. Meaning someone or something killed Tatike, and then someone or something placed him in the ceiling. Again, this is just from the family going to reporters and talking about their discussion with the hospital. The hospital's only official statement has basically been that they have cooperated with the family and they don't really know what happened to Tatike. Now, of course, this is a very strange story, but it gets even weirder. On May 10th, 2019, so about a year and a half after Tatike was found deceased in the Stellenbosch hospital ceiling, a 53-year-old father of 4 named Sandile Sibiya arrived at another hospital in South Africa. It was in a city called Durban, which is considered to be one of the nicest and wealthiest places in South Africa, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandile was a builder, and he had been working on a house when he had fallen and broken his leg. Specifically, he broke his femur bone, the bone that runs from your hip down to your knee, the big single bone in your thigh. So just for reference, if you break your femur, you can't walk. So, with some assistance from friends and family, Sandile hobbled his way into this hospital in Durban, and he began to receive care. 2 days later, on May 17th, Sandile was still in the hospital, still recovering from this broken femur, when his cousin came to visit him. The cousin said Sandile seemed totally normal, and that during this visit, Sandile told the cousin that after the cousin left, Sandile was going to be transported from this hospital to another hospital nearby, where he was going to get an x-ray of his leg, as well as talk to another orthopedic surgeon. But apparently, after this cousin left from this visit, the doctors at the Durban hospital walked into Sandile's room to take him and transport him to this other hospital, and Sandile was not in his room. Now, this hospital in Durban was known for their very tight security, and so right away, their reaction was very different than the Stellenbosch hospital's reaction. This hospital immediately contacted authorities and said, "We are missing a patient," and they began a very public search of their hospital for Sandile. But they couldn't find him. On May 18th, so 6 days after Sandile disappeared, the hospital in Durban began to smell this horrible stench coming from one wing of their hospital. And so hospital workers would track the stench to a janitor's closet, and when they opened it up, they saw this black liquid dripping out of the ceiling, and the liquid was coming from Sandile's decomposing body that was located in the ceiling. Sandile's autopsy would be carried out very quickly. However, the results of that autopsy have never been made public, and Sandile's family has not commented on the results of this autopsy. As of today, all we know is that within a 2-year period, 2 seemingly ordinary South African men, who both could either not walk at all or who could barely walk because of their physical injuries, somehow snuck out of their hospital rooms totally undetected by staff and then wound up dead in the hospital ceiling. Some say the men really did somehow sneak out of their own accord and decided to go into the ceiling, and that's what happened. Others say both men were murdered and then placed into the ceiling, and still others think
is just called MrBallen. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast features 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bad Blood, and it's about an infamous medical program in Alabama. The second story you'll hear is called Suspended, and it's about a very unexpected choking hazard. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Earworm, and it's about a song you should never sing. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please eat an orange in front of the Amazon Music follow button, and as you eat it, make a whole scene about how amazing it tastes. And then offer them the other orange you have, but don't tell them it's not really an orange, and that it's actually a fruit from a strychnine tree. Okay, let's get into our first story called Bad Blood.
In 1932, Charlie Pollard was a 26-year-old farmer living in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population at the time was African American, and they were all forced to live under the rules of a strictly segregated society. At the time, the United States was just beginning to crawl out of the Great Depression that had started 3 years earlier, but you wouldn't know it riding through Charlie's town. Like Charlie, many of the other residents in Macon County were completely dirt poor, and they lived in these wooden shacks with no screens on their windows, there was no furniture inside, and they would just throw some dirty rags on the ground to sleep on. On average, the men in the town that were lucky enough to have a job made less than $1 per day. So when Charlie heard a rumor that the government was going to be coming to town and giving free medical exams to all the African American men, Charlie was thrilled. He had never been to a doctor before, and he certainly wasn't going to turn down a free visit to one. And so a couple of days later, the rumor turned out to be true when a government health service worker showed up in their town and set up shop in their one-room schoolhouse. Charlie got in line with the hundreds of other men from Macon County, and then by mid-morning it was his turn, and the health service worker told him that today they were just going to be doing a blood test. And so Charlie eagerly rolled up his sleeve and stuck his arm out. A couple of days later, the results from the blood test had come in, and Charlie was informed that he had bad blood. Bad blood was a commonly used term in that area at the time to describe a wide array of ailments. The worker didn't get into specifics about what Charlie's diagnosis meant. They just told him that in virtue of his diagnosis of bad blood, he was now eligible to join a government-sponsored medical treatment program. If he agreed to be a part of it, he would not only receive medical care for his bad blood, he would also receive free rides to and from the health clinic, he would get a free hot meal on examination days, and in the event he died during the program, his family would be given $50 if they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy on his body before they buried him. Despite not really understanding what it meant to have bad blood, Charlie decided to join the program, mostly because of those free meals and because he had a deep trust and respect of the government. And Charlie wasn't alone. About 400 other African American men from Macon County agreed to be a part of the program as well. At first, the program was everything they promised it would be. It was just a couple of low-key medical examinations with a nice hot meal, and then occasionally they would take some pills and have another blood draw. But eventually they started being given regular, excruciatingly painful spinal taps that would leave them bedridden for weeks afterwards. But despite this painful and surprising turn of events that none of the men saw coming, they were not aware they would be getting spinal taps as part of this program. Charlie and the other men were convinced this program was still in their best interest and that they could trust the government to eventually cure them of their bad blood. And so Charlie and the other men didn't resist the spinal taps or other follow-on painful and bizarre medical procedures that they were being told was good for them and would help them get rid of this bad blood. Less than a year later, men in this program began getting sick. They started developing rashes and sores all over their body. Their bones and joints would ache. They began losing hair. They had indigestion. They had headaches. They had constant fevers. And for some of the men, these symptoms would eventually subside. But for others, they got dramatically worse. For those men, they would develop tumors and their bones would start to disintegrate. They would go blind or deaf or become paralyzed, or they would simply die. But despite the obvious ineffectiveness of this treatment program, it persisted. When America entered World War II in 1941, Charlie and many of the other men in this program wanted to enlist in the military and go join the fight. But when they went to enlist, they were told that as members of this special medical program, they could only receive treatment from the doctors in that program. And so they could not receive treatment from military doctors and therefore were disqualified from military service. While frustrated by this rule, Charlie and many of the other men still considered themselves to be very fortunate to be allowed to be a part of this program that was curing them of their bad blood. And Charlie specifically felt like he was one of the luckiest men inside of this program because his bad blood had not led to these terrible symptoms that his friends were experiencing. And so over the years, in between his medical appointments, Charlie got married, he had a child, he even managed to buy a little plot of land that he farmed on nearly year-round. Then, in 1973, so over 40 years after they began this medical program, Charlie and the other survivors of this program had their lives completely turned upside down. That year, a very junior assistant within the Public Health Service secretly mailed off all of the records of this Macon County medical program to the Associated Press. And then a couple of days later, the Washington Star newspaper ran this huge story on their front page that said syphilis victims in United States study went untreated for 40 years. It would turn out Charlie and the other 400 men in this medical program, they didn't have bad blood. That was just kind of a made-up term to get them not to ask any questions. What they had was syphilis, a deadly disease that ravages the human body in 3 stages that can unfold over a lifetime. And so these doctors that treated Charlie were not actually treating him. They knew he had syphilis. That was why he was even part of the program to begin with. When they tested his blood, they were trying to see who had syphilis in Macon County, and then they took those people and they entered them into this phony program, not to make them better, because this was not a treatment program. It was a US government-backed medical study of what happens to African American men with syphilis if their condition goes completely untreated for their entire lives. The leaders of the study did not care what happened to these men. And that point was made crystal clear when in the 1940s, a cure for syphilis was discovered, penicillin. But instead of giving it to these men and saving their lives, they intentionally hid the cure from them and prevented them from getting it. This is why these men were not allowed to enlist in the military or seek outside medical care, because those doctors would discover these men had syphilis and they would just give them penicillin, curing them, but that screwed up the study, and so they couldn't have that. The Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama, because at the time, 35% of the population was already infected with syphilis. And because they knew the men in this town would be largely uneducated and poor and desperate, and therefore easy to trick into joining this highly unethical study. At least 28 men in the study died as a result of their syphilis infections, and countless others suffered from long-term side effects. Charlie was 66 years old when he heard the news. Finally, he had an answer. Bad blood meant he had syphilis, but fortunately his syphilis had either burned out or gone dormant. But he thought about all the other men in the study that had not been as lucky, and Charlie felt so betrayed by the government. He and the rest of the men had no idea they were getting taken advantage of. Charlie got in touch with a lawyer who eventually sued the federal government, and in an out-of-court settlement, Charlie and the other 73 survivors of the so-called Tuskegee experiment were given $38,000 each as compensation. After the settlement, Charlie just went back to his simple life in Macon County, and then 27 years later, on April 29, 2000, Charlie passed away at the age of 94.
Our next story is called Suspended.
On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Jian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Jian must be. But Jian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Jian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Jian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Jian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Jian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Jian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving.
When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak, and then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed. And here we are, he has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles, but it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again. The next and final story of today's episode is called Earworm.
On the night of May 29th, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, it was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly looking for scrap metal to sell and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar. Because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got, and he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having, and then one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song, another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and get to know these people. One, because Robalito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robalito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robalito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robalito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, "Hey, we want another round of drinks." And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, "Thank you very much." And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, "Keep it up, you're doing great." And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note, and when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm, and so right away, the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, "We knew you were going to screw this up, this was a bad choice," and Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer. And now the bouncer had his beer down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, "What are you doing?" But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer. And all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered and he...
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast features 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Way, and it's about the creepy backstory to a very famous 90s song. The second story you'll hear is called High Stakes. What seems like a harmless dare turns out to have disastrous consequences. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Baltic Fleet, and it's about one of the biggest naval blunders of all time. But before we get the follow button out for a very On the evening of June 28, 1997, an 83-year-old woman named Leila Howard turned up the radio in the living room of her small home in Texas, and then she took a seat next to her husband, Raymond, on the couch. This was a song that both of them loved, and in the past, Leila knew her husband would have swooped her up and begun dancing with her right away. But Raymond was now 88 years old, he was also recovering from brain surgery, and they both were planning to go to bed in the next few minutes because they had a big day the next day. They were going to go to the Pioneer Day Music Festival, which is an annual fiddling festival located about 15 miles away from where Leila and Raymond lived, in the town of Salado, Texas. Leila and Raymond attended this festival basically every year, and so even though Raymond right now was a bit fragile from his surgery and his advanced age, the couple had not even considered missing it. Leila's son Hal had tried to persuade Leila to let him, Hal, drive the couple to the music festival, but Leila said no because Leila and Raymond were both fiercely independent and wanted to be in control of their lives, which included driving to and from this festival. Also, Leila had talked about maybe going someplace else after the festival ended with Raymond, kind of spontaneously just driving out and doing something, and so she really wanted to have her own car in case she did want to do that. And so after a few minutes, Leila and Raymond's favorite song came to an end, and the DJ hopped back on the radio and began talking about the weather and the traffic. And at that point, Raymond and Leila, they stood up from the couch, they took each other's hands, and they walked upstairs to go to bed. The next morning, so June 29th, Leila and Raymond walked out the front door of their house, and they walked down to their driveway where their Oldsmobile car was parked. Leila helped Raymond get into the passenger seat, and then Leila took her spot in the driver's seat. And then a few moments later, after they were all buckled in and situated, Leila fired up the car, backed out the driveway, and began driving. That evening, Leila's son, Hal, decided to swing by Leila and Raymond's house to check in on them and see how the festival went. And so at about 5 p.m., Hal got to their house, and right away when he pulled up, he noticed that Leila and Raymond's car, the Oldsmobile, was not in the driveway. And so Hal thought that was pretty odd because by now they should have been back from the festival. In years past, they would always get home by about 3 p.m. at the absolute latest because they didn't like staying out late. And so it just seemed odd that they were not back by now. But at the same time, Hal knew that Leila had been thinking about maybe going out and doing something spontaneous after the event was over. And so he thought, maybe his mom and Raymond were out driving around somewhere and they'd be back later. But just for good measure, Hal did park the car and he walked up to the front door of the house and he did knock. But when there was no answer, he thought, you know what, I'll just go home and come back in a few hours and check in on them at that point. And so, a few hours later, at 8 p.m., Hal drove back to Leila and Raymond's house, and when he got there, he saw their car was still not back yet. And so now Hal's starting to feel pretty worried, and so he parked the car, he walked up to the front door, he did knock, there was no answer, and so he pulled out his set of keys, he opened up the door, and he walked inside. Now, as soon as he was in the house, nothing looked out of place. It actually looked very organized and clean like it normally was. But as he walked around looking for some sign of where Leila and Raymond were, all he could find was on one of the beds there were all these neat stacks of clothes that were laid out as if somebody was getting ready to pack but didn't finish packing. And so it just seemed like something's off here, something's not right. This doesn't seem like they just went out and did something spontaneous. Something must have happened at the festival. That's why they're not back yet. And so kind of in a panic, Hal ran outside and he called the police. And after reporting Leila and Raymond missing, he actually began calling news stations and telling them, can you please put out my mom and Raymond's picture because they're older and they're missing. I need your help. And in fact, that night, those TV stations did begin putting out all these reports about how Leila and Raymond were missing and for people to be on the lookout for them and their car. At the same time, the police immediately launched an investigation, and they quickly discovered that Leila and Raymond had never even made it to the music festival. They never got there. And then when the police drove the route that Leela would have taken to get to the music festival, they didn't find any car accidents or anything unusual on the route that would indicate that they got into some trouble or something. They checked their phone records and Leela and Raymond had called nobody. There was no action on their credit cards, and so they hadn't bought anything. And the police would send out all these missing person reports to police officers all over the state of Texas, and nobody reported seeing anything or hearing anything. That is, until 3 days later on July 2nd. On that night, a police officer in a little town in Arkansas, located 500 miles away from where Leela and Raymond lived, this police officer was driving down the road when he spotted an Oldsmobile that was driving with its lights off. And so the officer pulled the car over and he ran the license plate, and it came back as belonging to Leela and Raymond. But you gotta remember that this police officer was in Arkansas, and so he had not received any updates about this missing couple. All those TV broadcasts and all the missing person alerts that were getting sent out all over the place, those were really only happening in the state of Texas. And so this officer has no clue that Leela and Raymond are missing. But he runs the plate, he sees it belongs to Leela and Raymond, and he goes up to the driver's side window, and he looks inside, and he sees Leela and Raymond. Leela's driving, Raymond's in the passenger seat, and they look like a really happy older couple. And the officer would say to Leela, "Hey, you're driving with your lights off." And Leela would say, "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. We were driving in Texas and we got lost, and I just didn't notice. I'm really sorry." The officer believed her and felt like these were good people who just made an honest mistake, and so he just flicked her lights on and said, "I'm going to give you a warning, no big deal, no ticket, but be careful with your lights. You got to make sure those are on at night." And Leela said, "Thank you very much. Of course, I'll be very careful with my lights." And then actually the officer gave Leela directions on how to get back to Texas from Arkansas. And then he got back in his cruiser, and then he watched as Leela and Raymond pulled onto the main road and then disappeared into the darkness. The police officer in Arkansas who pulled them over would eventually put it together who he had pulled over, and at that point, Arkansas would get in on the search for Leela and Raymond. But for the next 2 weeks, despite having both states aggressively searching for this couple, nobody could find them. That is until July 12th, so that's 10 days after Leela and Raymond got pulled over by that cop in Arkansas. On that day, these two young boys were walking by a small stream in a town called Hot Springs, Arkansas, when they began to smell a terrible smell. They would end up telling their parents, who would come back to the stream and they'd smell it too, and they would end up alerting the police, and the police would come out and they would search that entire area, and they would find Leela and Raymond's Oldsmobile at the base of a 25-foot cliff, and inside the vehicle were Leela and Raymond, and they were both deceased. It looked very much like Leela and Raymond had driven off this cliff and they had landed down below, and that's what killed them. But when investigators went up to the top of that cliff, there were no skid marks on the cliff itself, which meant Leela, who was driving, never hit the brakes as she went over the cliff. Nobody knows why Leela and Raymond abruptly left their town and drove hundreds of miles into Arkansas instead of going to their favorite music festival, although their family members have speculated that it could be because Leela and Raymond had declining cognitive function, and so they basically didn't know what was going on, and that's why it happened. But this story about Leela and Raymond is what inspired a very, very famous song from the late 1990s. It's called The Way by Fastball, and for copyright reasons, we can't play it for you, but I'll sing you a line and see if you can remember this song. Where were they going without ever knowing the way? Anyone can see the road that they walk on is paved in gold. It's always summer, you'll never get cold. You'll never be hungry, you'll never be old and gray. Boom, there you go. If you know the song, now you know it's got a pretty intense backstory. Our next story is called High Stakes.
On October 20th, 1986, Captain Alexander Kluyev was piloting a passenger plane that was about to descend down into a Russian airport for a layover. On board this plane were 94 occupants, including passengers and crew. And as the captain began going over in his mind the different steps he would need to follow to land this plane, he practically sighed with boredom. He had always thought life as a pilot would be exciting and interesting, but all he ever did were these short commercial flights around Russia, and they lacked any sort of thrill. In fact, the captain had flown this particular route so many times, he could practically do it in his sleep. And so as the captain was about to begin yet another boring descent to end yet another boring flight, he was suddenly struck with a very unexpected idea. And as he thought about it, he stopped what he was doing, and he just turned to his co-pilot, whose name was Gennady Zernov, and he said, "Hey, Gennady, can I ask you something?" At the same time that Captain Alexander and Gennady were having this conversation up in the cockpit, down on the ground inside of that Russian airport where the captain was supposed to land, an air traffic controller noticed on their radar that Captain Alexander's plane was coming in way too fast and at too steep of an angle to attempt the landing. And so the controller radioed up to the captain and said, "Hey, you're going too fast. Adjust your speed, adjust your angle. Otherwise, you're going to need to abort this landing." But the captain did not radio anything back to the controller. Instead, the plane continued its descent at the same angle and the same speed, and to the controller's horror, they looked out the window and literally saw the plane was lowering its landing gear. Like, clearly they are going to attempt to land, even though this looks so dangerous. And so the controller, in a bit of a panic, radios again up to the captain and says, "Hey, you're still coming in too fast, too steep of an angle, abort the landing." But again, the captain did not respond. What Captain Alexander had said to Gennady when he said, "Hey, can I ask you something?" was, "Hey, do you want to make a bet that I can land this plane blind?" And Gennady, who was also very bored, thought, "You know what? That's a great idea. Let's do it." And so the two pilots lowered all the shades inside of the cockpit, blocking all of the windows, so Captain Alexander literally can't see anything except for his instruments. And then Captain Alexander attempted to land the plane. And when the air traffic controller began calling up to Captain Alexander saying, "You're going too fast, your angle's wrong," Captain Alexander was sure he could pull it off, and so he totally ignored the controller and went for the runway. And when he hit the runway, he was going too fast at too steep of an angle, and so it broke off the landing gear, the plane skidded all the way down the runway, and then flipped over and caught on fire. Out of the 94 people who were on board that plane, 70 would perish, including the co-pilot Gennady Zernov. As for Captain Alexander, who orchestrated this whole tragedy, well, he actually survived, and he was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Baltic Fleet.
Around the turn of the 20th century, Russia and Japan got into a dispute over who should be in control of Korea and China. Looking to avoid an armed conflict, the Japanese sent the Russians a deal that came with reasonable concessions on both sides. But the Russians didn't like it, they rejected the deal, and they countered with a pretty unreasonable deal that came with lots of concessions for Japan and not so many for Russia. And so Japan rejected that deal and then promptly launched a devastating surprise attack on the Russian Navy stationed at Fort Arthur in China. This attack would officially start the one-year-long Russo-Japanese War. The Russians knew they would need to send a replacement naval fleet up to Fort Arthur to reclaim it from the Japanese, but unfortunately, the attack at Fort Arthur had totally wiped out all of Russia's best sailors and all their best ships, putting Russia at a major disadvantage to start this war. And so as Russians are wondering what they're going to do next, the Russian Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, authorizes an unbelievable mission. He orders the Russian Baltic Fleet to set sail from their harbor in northern Europe and sail 18,000 miles around the world to Japan, where they will defeat the Japanese and then reclaim Fort Arthur. The fact that none of the Baltic Fleet ships were designed to sail that far of a distance, or that there were literally 0 refueling points along their massive projected path, was considered largely inconsequential and ignored. What was also considered inconsequential was how absurdly unqualified the Baltic crew was. The sailors were mostly illiterate peasants that did not grow up on the coasts, and so they showed up for military training with no seafaring skills. And then, after their military training, they still had no seafaring skills because the Baltic Fleet's harbor was frozen solid almost year-round. But the Tsar believed the man he had put in charge of this crew, Admiral Rojesvenski, would make up for their deficiencies. And this belief was not unwarranted. Admiral Rojesvenski was the best Russian officer that had not been killed in that Japan surprise attack. He had significant combat experience, and he had a wickedly bad temper. He didn't care who you were. If you were doing something he didn't like, he was going to beat the crap out of you. Literally. And when he was told he was going to be in charge of this fairly inexperienced crew, he was certain his rough style would whip these Baltic boys into shape, and they would be very successful. But when he laid eyes on the Baltic Fleet, he realized this was going to be a little bit more challenging than he realized. In addition to being less than satisfied with his fighting crew, he was equally dissatisfied with the 2 senior officers that were assigned to be his direct support. And he immediately gave them nicknames, and he would only refer to them by their nicknames, right to their face. The first one was the manure sack, and the other was a vast empty space. As for the Baltic Fleet's 45 ships, they were terrible. Because this unit never went out on the ocean because their harbor was always frozen, Russia didn't waste their good ships on them. So all they had were really old, obsolete warships, and then non-military ships like ferries and yachts that they just slapped random guns onto. They also had ships that the Baltic Fleet crew enthusiastically called futuristic, which were these ships that came out of Russia briefly copying French engineering, which involved these crazy top-heavy ships that sat so low in the water that their lowest rung of weapons, their cannons that poked out the windows at the bottom of the ship, they didn't work because they sat under the water permanently. But regardless of their shortfalls, the Baltic Fleet was what Rojesvenski had been dealt, and so he had to just get them moving if they were going to win the war. And so on October 16th, 1904, Admiral Rojesvenski ordered all of his men to take their positions in all of their ships, and they set sail. And immediately, 30 seconds into their trip, the lead ship ran aground, and another ship lost its anchor, even though it should not have been casting its anchor to begin with. And so while one ship is trying to refloat and the other is trying to find its anchor in the ocean, a third ship comes along and broadsides a fourth ship. And it does so much damage to this fourth ship, that ship had to go back home. But once they overcame these initial obstacles, the Baltic Fleet that now numbered 44 ships made it out of the harbor without any more issues and then set sail for the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. As they drew closer, Manursak informed Rojesvenski that there might be an issue, that he had heard rumblings amongst the crew that they believed Japanese torpedo boats were stationed off the coast of Denmark waiting for them to get there. Rojesvenski told Manursak that that was impossible. The Japanese torpedo boats did not have the capabilities to sail 18,000 miles to Denmark, and even if they did have the ability to do that, they could not have gotten there in such a short period of time. But Manursak told Rojesvenski that unfortunately, even though logically that makes sense, this rumor had spread all across the crew. And so Rojesvenski began sending out messages to all the other ships, telling them there are no Japanese torpedo boats waiting for us off the coast of Denmark, everybody just needs to calm down. And these messages did appear to work at first, because eventually another rumor began to circulate, one that Rojesvenski was not really aware of as it was happening, and that was that the crew began to believe there was a huge minefield underneath them. Everywhere they went, there was a minefield. And everybody got so worked up about it that it made its way back to a lot of the captains actually piloting the different ships. And at some point, the pilots just began doing these evasive maneuvers, and Rojesvenski's looking around wondering what they're doing, and they began crashing into each other, trying to avoid this minefield. When Rojesvenski finally figured out what was going on, he sent out even more messages telling them that there's no minefield under us. It's totally safe. Everybody just needs to calm down. And so it took Rojesvenski going out on deck and firing shots into the air to finally get people to stop believing they were on top of a minefield. But just a couple of hours later, after Rojesvenski had gone back up to the bridge and was just looking out, surveying his fleet as they carried on towards Denmark and Sweden, when all of a sudden, towards the very front of his fleet, he heard this unbelievable barrage of cannon fire. One of his own ships was engaging something out in front of the fleet, but Rojesvenski was too far away to see what it was, and then a message came through from the attacking ship, whose name was Kamchatka, and they said they were surrounded on all sides by at least 8 Japanese torpedo boats. And so Rojesvenski runs out onto the deck, looking out towards the horizon, expecting to see these 8 Japanese ships, but he doesn't. And then all of a sudden, the shooting just completely stops and it's silent. And then Rojesvenski notices on his right side, a small little fishing boat is making its way right up alongside his. It would turn out Kamchatka, the attacking ship, had confused this little unarmed Russian fishing ship with 8 Japanese torpedo boats and had opened fire. But luckily, even though they fired hundreds and hundreds of rounds at this little boat, none of them hit the boat. And so the fishermen were fine. And the fishermen had actually been sent to the boat, specifically by Tsar Nicholas II, to tell Rojesvenski that he had been promoted. And so Rojesvenski apologizes to the fishermen for having shot at them hundreds and hundreds of times, and they said it was okay, and the fishermen carried on. After Rojesvenski chewed out the crew of the Kamchatka, the rest of the Baltic fleet gathered up, and they continued towards the narrow waters between Denmark and Sweden. When they got close, a Danish resupply ship came out to meet them to give them fuel and food and water, and the Baltic fleet mistook them for a Japanese torpedo boat, causing them to ram them repeatedly. And then they realized their mistake, but at that point they had done severe damage to the resupply ship, who had to immediately turn around and go back to shore. After that, the Baltic fleet did manage to get past Denmark and Sweden, and they made it out to the North Sea. But as soon as they got out there was trouble. One of the captains of the ships that was towards the front of the Baltic fleet's formation spotted 4 Japanese torpedo boats coming right at them. And so this ship, along with 6 others, immediately just began engaging these 4 ships with everything they had. Cannons, big guns, small guns, everything. It was absolute chaos from the front of this formation. And the amount of gunfire that was going off towards the front caused the rest of the ships that were not part of the attack to begin to panic. And the other ship captains began ramming into each other to try to get away from this attack. And so while that's going on, all the crew members on all the ships begin drawing their swords and running around, expecting the Japanese to board them at any moment. And the others that did not draw their swords put on life jackets and laid down on their back on the deck of the ship, believing that was procedure for how to survive a sinking ship. And so for the next 20 minutes, it was just continuous gunfire coming from the front of their formation. One of the attacking ships sent a message back to Rojesvenski that said they had been hit by a torpedo and they were taking heavy fire and it was just absolute bedlam up there. And then all of a sudden, it just totally stopped. And when the smoke cleared, Rojesvenski and his ship had been able to maneuver up a little bit closer and they could see what they were shooting at. And it would turn out, once again, it was a case of mistaken identity. They were not being attacked by Japanese torpedo boats. They had spotted 4 small British fishing boats. And in the chaos of the gunfight, the Baltic fleet had inadvertently begun to fire at each other, killing several crew members and badly damaging their ships in the process. As for the British fishermen, only one of their boats actually sunk, despite the fact that the Baltic fleet had fired thousands and thousands of rounds at them, and they had been stationary the entire time. The Russian Tsar immediately apologized to Britain, but the British media went crazy and the British people called for war, believing that this type of attack could not possibly be an accident. But Russian diplomats leveled with the British and said, no, this really was an accident. And eventually they convinced them, avoiding starting yet another war. Rojesvenski and his Baltic fleet were allowed to continue in their journey, and after a couple of weeks, they were getting close to Africa when one of his ships, the Kamchatka, the same ship that believed they were surrounded by 8 Japanese torpedo boats, they got separated from the main fleet and got lost. And so Rojesvenski and the other officers did what they could to try to locate them, but nobody had seen where they went, and there wasn't great technology to try to locate them, and so unfortunately, Rojesvenski and the Baltic fleet just had to continue on and hope that at some point the lost ship would find them again. A few days later, the main body arrived in Tangier, and lo and behold, Kamchatka showed up. And they informed Rojesvenski that they had gotten lost, and they didn't really have a good answer for that. But once they were lost, they managed to engage 3 separate Japanese torpedo boats. But it would turn out they were not Japanese torpedo boats. They were in fact a German, a Swedish, and a French fishing boat. But none of Kamchatka's rounds actually impacted any of the 3 vessels, and so 3 more wars were averted. And so now that Rojesvenski had his lost ship back, he gathered up his full Baltic fleet, and they left Tangier. But on their way out, one of the ships managed to cut the underwater telegraph line to Tangier, cutting off Tangier's communication with Europe for the next 4 days. By now, the Baltic fleet was very low on coal, but they had a planned rendezvous with a German resupply ship off the coast of West Africa. When they got there, the crew decided they didn't want to do another resupply later on, and so let's just take double coal this time. And so they hauled all this extra coal onto their ships despite not having a place for it, and so naturally they began throwing it in the halls and in their bedrooms and basically anywhere there was space. And what that did is it led to a fine layer of coal dust all over everything in the ship. And that, combined with the intense humidity off the coast of Africa, led to this black coal gunk getting trapped inside of all of the sailors' lungs, which began killing several of them. A couple weeks later, as they rounded the southern tip of Africa, it finally rained on them, washing away a lot of that coal dust on their ships, which was a big relief. But the rain turned into a pretty bad storm, and so Rojesvenski decided he just wanted all of his ships to call in and say they were okay. And so one by one, each of the ships were told to message him saying the words, "We are okay." And so one by one, each of the ships did this until it got to Kamchatka's turn. And they accidentally sent the message, "Do you see Japanese torpedo boats?" And of course, this message spread like wildfire across the entire crew, which led to mass hysteria, and Rojesvenski's trying to send out messages to say, "No, there's no Japanese torpedo boats," but it's too late. The other captains are panicking, and they're ramming into each other and firing blindly into the wind. From that point forward, every night, Rojesvenski would go up onto the bow of his ship, and he would scream obscenities at Kamchatka. When the Baltic fleet finally made it to Madagascar, the morale amongst the crew was very low. And so when they docked in Madagascar, the crew decided it would be a good idea to boost their morale by buying some pets to bring back on board the ship with them. And the pets they decided to bring back were crocodiles and poisonous snakes. When their handlers smuggled them back on board their ship, they immediately escaped down into the bowels of the ship. When they went looking for them, they couldn't find them because the ships were in such bad shape. There were all sorts of cracks and holes all over the interior for these animals to escape to. And so the men just had to accept there were very dangerous predators just living on their ship with them. And so most men were unable to sleep at night in fear of being attacked by these animals, which led a number of them to go for real insane. And so the pets idea didn't really boost morale amongst the Baltic fleet, and so one of the officers decided he would take another crack at boosting spirits. And so he went to a vendor in Madagascar, and he purchased 2,000 of their finest cigarettes to bring back on board. So he brings them back on board, he hands them all out, and everyone's so thankful. But it turns out those cigarettes were laced with enormous amounts of opium, which led to hundreds of the crew members becoming hopelessly addicted to opium. Also in Madagascar, the sailors picked up dozens of diseases that began wiping them out in droves. During one funeral for a crew member, the Kamchatka asked if they could fire a salute with blank rounds. They were given permission, but they accidentally fired live rounds into the ship right next to them. When Rojesvenski and the rest of the Baltic fleet finally left Madagascar, their only refrigerator on board one of their ships broke. which spoiled all of their meat, tons and tons of meat. And so they began throwing it overboard, which attracted hundreds and hundreds of sharks, which circled their ships for the rest of their journey. Rojesvenski desperately wanted to find a way to somehow train the remainder of the Baltic fleet how to be somewhat militarily competent. And so he decided he would make them all do target practice because that had been a big issue on this trip so far. And so he had one ship attach a long line that was connected to a target in the water, and that ship would pull the target along, and the other ships would take shots at the target. And so all of the ships on Rojesvenski's call began firing at this target, and after thousands and thousands of rounds, they didn't hit the target once. However, they managed to continuously shoot the ship that was pulling the target. For Rojesvenski, this was the final straw. He felt like he could do absolutely nothing to make the Baltic fleet an actual military force. And so he sent a message back to the Tsar and said, "You got to replace me. I need to resign and somebody else needs to come in and take over." And the Tsar said, "No, this is your fleet." And so begrudgingly, Rojesvenski continued on leading the Baltic fleet until they finally, after 7 total months on the sea, were within striking distance of their target in Japan. The night before, as they prepared for their attack, they went into stealth mode where all the ships killed all of their lights. So they're totally dark, with the exception of their hospital ship. That kept their lights on. This was considered a rule of war at the time, which both sides abided by. And so while the Baltic fleet was sitting out in the waters outside of Japan, a small fishing boat began coming towards them. Now, the fishing boat could only see the lit-up hospital ship. They could not see the 43 other darkened ships. And so a crew member on board this hospital ship came up to the railing and he recognized the fishing boat was actually a Russian fishing boat. And so he waved them down, and when the Russian fishermen came outside, the crew member told him, "You gotta stop because there's 43 ships behind me that have their lights off. Do not go this way, go around." And so the Russian fisherman thanked him and turned around and went on his merry way. Except that wasn't a Russian fisherman, it was a Japanese sailor on board a Japanese torpedo boat. And now they knew exactly where the Baltic fleet was. And so that night, the Japanese Navy completely surrounded the Baltic fleet, and then the next day at daybreak, they launched their attack. It was called the Battle of Tsushima, and it was obscenely lopsided. The Japanese Navy completely wiped out the Baltic fleet, killing 4,000 of their crew members and capturing 7,300 others, which included Rojesvenski, who had been badly wounded in the battle, but he would survive. In October of 2002, Mark and his wife Kathy were on their way to a baby shower in Baltimore, Maryland that was being held for them by Kathy's family. It would be a 7-hour drive from their home in Ohio, so Mark and Kathy tried to get out the door as early as possible, but one thing led to another and they got a pretty late start. By midnight, they were only about an hour away from their final destination, but they both desperately needed a bathroom break. And so they pulled into a rest stop in Frederick County, Maryland, which is about an hour outside of Washington, D.C. The rest area parking lot was completely vacant except for one car, which was a dark blue late model 4-door sedan that was parked head-in right in front of the bathroom. Mark and Kathy pulled into a spot that was a few over from the sedan. They got out, they walked up to the restroom. Mark was done first, so he waited outside of the women's restroom for his wife. As he waited, he turned around to face the sedan that initially, when he first pulled in the lot, he believed was empty. But now, as he's looking at it, he can clearly see there are 2 people in the front 2 seats. A middle-aged man who's sitting behind the steering wheel looking directly at Mark, and then next to this guy is a sleeping teenager. And immediately, Mark felt really creeped out by these 2 guys. I mean, they are in this random rest stop in the middle of the night. They're the only ones there, and this guy is just staring menacingly at Mark. And so Mark's doing his best not to be intimidated and to stand his ground and not act fazed by what's happening right in front of him. But in the back of his mind, he is just praying his wife comes out of that bathroom as soon as possible so they can get the heck out of here and away from these 2 creepy guys. Finally, his wife did come out. He grabbed her by the hand and without any explanation, rushed them back to their car, hopped in, locked the doors, turned it on, and began backing out. And as he did, he looked over at the sedan and he saw the guy behind the steering wheel, the middle-aged guy, was looking over at Mark with that same menacing look on his face. Mark also noticed there was something odd about the sedan's trunk. There was a fist-size hole right above the license plate where you would normally put the key inside of. So the whole scene was just totally bizarre, and after Mark and Kathy sped out and were back on the highway, Mark explained to Kathy that there were actually two people inside of that sedan and they really creeped him out, and that's why he had grabbed her and rushed them back into the car. And so she agreed that was pretty creepy, but by the time the couple got to the baby shower in Baltimore, they had completely forgotten about their experience at the rest stop. The baby shower went well, and before long, Mark and Kathy were back home in Ohio. About a week later, the couple was watching TV in their home when a breaking news bulletin came across, and it showed a reporter who was standing at the exact same rest stop that they had stopped in on the way to Baltimore in Frederick County, Maryland, and behind them was the same late model sedan that they had seen parked at that rest stop when they had pulled in. The headline of this special news bulletin was DC Snipers Caught. It would turn out that middle-aged man sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan staring at Mark was none other than John Allen Muhammad, and the guy next to him, the teenager who was sleeping, was Lee Boyd Malvo. These were the two men that were responsible for the highly coordinated 3-week-long attack that left 10 people dead in the Washington, D.C. area. The fist-size hole that Mark saw on the back of their trunk was what they used to shoot through because it allowed them to stay concealed in the trunk while they were shooting. Mohammed and Malvo had been using that particular rest stop in Frederick County as a place to hide out in between their killings. When Mark and Kathy pulled in next to them, they were only halfway through their killing spree. Mark believes the only reason he and his wife were not targeted is because the killers most likely were trying to keep this rest stop off the radar because it was their hiding spot, and so they wouldn't have risked an attack there. Although, ironically, they would ultimately be caught in that rest stop. Muhammad was executed by lethal injection in 2009, and Malvo is serving a life sentence.
Our next story is called Luggage.
From the time Gareth Williams was a young boy, his parents knew he was extremely gifted. When he was just 17 years old, he achieved a first-class honors mathematics degree from a university in his hometown of Wales. A couple of years after that, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester in England. And after that, he was accepted into a postgraduate course at one of the most prestigious universities in the world, Cambridge. But he wouldn't finish that degree because his incredible academic achievements had got the attention of Britain's intelligence agencies, and they began recruiting him. In 2001, when Gareth was 23, Britain's communication headquarters, commonly known as GCHQ, which is one of Britain's main intelligence agencies, offered him a job as a codebreaker. He eagerly accepted the job, dropped out of Cambridge, and then moved into a modest apartment in Cheltenham, which is the resort town about 88 miles away from London where GCHQ is located. And there he would live and work for the next 10 years. Despite being an intensely private and shy person, Gareth was a highly valued team player whose genius in mathematics and technology helped his group win a number of Britain's highest awards for international code breaking. In 2009, one of Britain's other main intelligence agencies, the famous Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6 for short, they were so impressed with Gareth that they offered him a job to come over and work for them. This was a very rare chance for Gareth to go operational and become a spy in the kind of Hollywood sense of the word. He would effectively become a real-life James Bond, and so he jumped at the chance. But shortly after taking the job and moving to London, he regretted his decision. He hated the intense competitiveness within MI6, the flashy cars and flashy lifestyles, and the pressure to go out and party with your coworkers every weekend. Gareth just wanted to do his job and then be left alone. At GCHQ, nobody cared he felt that way. But at MI6, this behavior made him an outsider. Before he left MI6, he took his annual 2-week vacation. But when the vacation was over, he didn't come back to work at his office in London. And for some reason, MI6 never checked in on him to see where he was. It wasn't until his sister called police after not hearing from him that anybody looked into his disappearance. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer went to Gareth's apartment in London to do a welfare check. After knocking on the door and not getting an answer from Gareth, the officer got the key to the apartment from the landlord and went inside. He yelled out for Gareth. There was no sign of him on the first floor. He went upstairs to see if maybe Gareth was up there. He's yelling for him the whole way as he's going up. He gets to the second floor, there's nobody up there, but there's a closed door. And what he finds on the other side of that closed door would make international headlines for weeks. When he opened the door, he walked into a bathroom, and there was nothing unusual about the bathroom, except in the bathtub there was this big red duffel bag. And inside of that duffel bag was the badly decomposed body of Gareth Williams. The zipper of the bag was padlocked shut on the outside, and the key to this padlock was underneath Gareth's body inside of the bag. There were no fingerprints on the rim or inside the bathtub. There were also no fingerprints on the bag itself, or on the two zippers, or on the padlock, or on the keys. Gareth's iPhone had been found nearby sitting on a table, and it had been factory reset. And later, investigators would determine it had been reset on August 15th, which was the last day Gareth was seen on scene. The investigation by police, there was never a conclusive determination as to what exactly happened to Gareth, although there are many theories. Some say the Russian mafia killed him because right before he died, he had been focusing on money laundering in Britain that was tied to the Russian mafia, which would have made him a target. Another theory is MI6 had something to do with Gareth's death, which is why they were not so eager to go looking for him when he didn't come back from his vacation. In fact, one former MI6 agent has come out and said he believes there was a cover-up. He was interviewed by CNN and said that it looked like MI6 had gone into Gareth's apartment ahead of the police and wiped it all down, removing fingerprints and DNA evidence. The last prominent theory is that Gareth did this to himself. It was discovered that he made occasional online visits to bondage sites, and at least one time he'd had to yell out to his landlord to help get him out of his bed because he had tied his wrist to the bed frame and couldn't get himself undone. But when two experts who were a part of the investigation attempted to put themselves inside of a similar-sized duffel bag and lock it with the padlock on the outside, they couldn't do it despite trying over 400 times. And even if Gareth could have somehow physically got himself inside of this bag and locked it from the outside, how could he have done that without leaving fingerprints all over the bag, all over the lock, the zippers, all over the tub? Because when he was found, he didn't have gloves on. Ultimately, despite the red flags, Gareth's death was determined to be probably an accident and was closed 3 years after his death.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Bear, the Plane, and the Duffel.
In early December of 1985, in the Chattahoochee National Forest in northern Georgia, a hunter was very carefully making his way through the trees trying to track a deer. Now, this hunter had been tracking this deer for over a mile, but it had been a while since he had seen any signs of it being anywhere nearby. And as this hunter continued to creep along, he became increasingly aware of how loud each of his steps were, because the ground all around him was covered in dry leaves, and so every step he was taking was creating a loud crunching sound. And so eventually this hunter just came to a stop and decided stalking this deer was totally pointless because he was basically scaring it away with these crunching sounds as he got closer to it. But before this hunter was ready to just give up and head back to his vehicle, he continued on a little bit further, and when he pushed through this particularly dense brush area, he saw this clearing up ahead. And the second he saw what was in this clearing, he froze, took a step back into the brush, and then ducked down behind a rock. Because in that clearing, he saw an animal, and it wasn't a deer. It was a huge American black bear. Now, generally speaking, American black bears are not aggressive towards humans. However, if, for example, you were to accidentally sneak up on a black bear, like this hunter had done, and you suddenly startled it by just showing your presence, the bear might react by pouncing on you and ripping you to bits. And so this hunter, with his back pressed up against the rock and his rifle gripped tightly across his chest, he's thinking about that and wondering what he's going to do to get out of this situation. At first he thought, okay, I'll just stand up and quietly walk away. But then he remembered how loud the leaves were, and even though he had been lucky walking in, he hadn't alerted the bear to his presence. On the way out, he was worried he wouldn't be so lucky, that those leaves would alert the bear to his position. And so the hunter began thinking, okay, well, what if I just stand up and start shooting at this bear? But the hunter knew the big issue with that plan is he had a deer hunting rifle, which is not nearly powerful enough to quickly take down a black bear, if at all. And so if he starts shooting at this bear, there was a very good chance that the bear would just turn around and maul him before he was able to put the bear down with his rifle. And so as this hunter is going through these scenarios behind the rock, he realizes something. He hasn't heard this bear at all. Now, bears in general are very loud animals. Just their regular breathing is so guttural and noisy that you can hear it a pretty good distance away. And the hunter's thinking to himself, I can't hear it breathing. And come to think of it, I haven't heard this bear once since I've been near it. And so the hunter very carefully stood up from behind his rock and turned around. And then he kind of peered forward into the brush, looking back into this clearing. And when he spotted the bear again, he realized immediately the bear was dead. The bear was kind of slumped forward and its body almost looked like a deflated balloon. The hunter was so relieved, he almost started laughing. And so he stepped out from behind his rock and he made his way through the brush into the clearing to get a better look at this bear. And when the hunter was right over the top of this bear looking down at it, something immediately struck him as very odd. This bear was far too young to have died of natural causes. However, after this hunter kind of poked and prodded the bear and lifted it up on either side to try to look underneath it, he couldn't see any visible injuries. It was like this bear had just randomly dropped dead. But the hunter didn't spend much time thinking about what happened to this bear. Instead, he thought to himself, there has to be some sort of logical explanation for what killed it. And with one last look at the bear on the ground, the hunter turned around and began the long walk back through the woods back to his vehicle. It would turn out there was an explanation for what happened to that bear. However, it was anything but logical. But to get to that non-logical explanation, we first have to go back in time. Around 11:30 p.m. on September 10th, 1985, so 3 months before the hunter discovered this dead bear, 2 pilots were flying their little 6-seater Cessna airplane over northern Georgia, making their way north towards Tennessee. And as these pilots flew along very casually, they suddenly intercepted over their radio a voice message that they definitely were not supposed to hear. It sounded like other pilots communicating with each other, and what they were talking about was how they were now going to follow this little Cessna airplane that they could see that was currently flying over northern Georgia. Now, radio traffic like this can only really be intercepted if your radio that's doing the intercepting is physically close to the person doing the transmitting. And so knowing this, the 2 pilots in this little Cessna knew that whoever was talking about following that little Cessna, they had to be talking about them, the 2 pilots in that Cessna. Now, for most pilots, if you suddenly overheard a radio transmission that your plane was getting followed by some other pilots, you might reach out to those pilots and say, hey, why are you following me? What's going on? Now, the co-pilot of this little Cessna might have wanted to react that way. However, before he could, the main pilot stopped him and said, I actually know exactly why somebody might want to tail us, and unfortunately, we're both going to have to jump out of this plane. Before the co-pilot could really even react to this news, the main pilot had set the Cessna on autopilot, which sets the plane to fly in a straight direction going at a constant speed at a constant altitude until either a pilot comes back and takes the craft back over, or if it just stays on autopilot, it eventually will run out of fuel and crash or run into something. And so after the main pilot had done that, he turned to the co-pilot and gestured for him to come with him into the main cabin of the aircraft, basically the main body of the craft where all their luggage was. And the co-pilot, he's so confused about what's happening, he's so panicked that he just follows the main pilot. So the 2 of them, they climb back over the 2 front seats, they go into the main body of the craft, and the main pilot begins strapping parachutes onto some of their luggage. And as he's doing this, he tells the co-pilot to open up the side door of the plane. And so again, the co-pilot is just so caught off guard, he has no idea how to handle this, and so he reaches over and he slides open this door of this moving plane. And as soon as he did, this huge rush of cold night air blasted inside of the cabin, and it became so loud from the howling wind coming in that the two pilots couldn't even talk to each other. And then the main pilot just began pushing the luggage out of the plane just into the night, falling straight down to the ground far, far below them. And at some point, the co-pilot just joined him and began pushing the luggage out of the plane. And then after all the luggage was out, the main pilot shoved a parachute into the hands of the co-pilot and said, put it on. He had to gesture for it because they couldn't hear each other. And so as this co-pilot's struggling to get on his parachute, the main pilot puts on his chute. And then right after the co-pilot has just barely got his parachute on, the main pilot pushes him out the side of the plane, and then the main pilot jumps out after him. So they basically abandoned their plane, which was still set to autopilot, so at some point, it was just going to crash. About 5 hours later, in a suburb of Knoxville, Tennessee, an 85-year-old man named Fred Myers was just waking up. Fred always got up before sunrise. It was part of his daily routine. He would wake up, he would get dressed, he would wash and shave his face, and then he would sit down and read the local newspaper. This simple routine was actually very important to Fred because recently he had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, which is a progressive disease that destroys memory. And so having this sort of set routine helped him manage his symptoms. Basically, at least in the morning, he could go into autopilot and go through this routine and not get confused. However, on this particular morning, something would happen that would leave Fred more confused than he had ever been in his entire life. Fred had made it to his bathroom, he had washed his face, and he had begun shaving when out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange outside in his driveway. He could see it through a nearby window, but it was still so dark outside, Fred couldn't tell what this thing was out there. And so feeling very curious, Fred put his razor blade down and he made his way over to the window to get a better look. And when he reached the window and looked out at his driveway and saw what this strange thing was, he could not believe his eyes. There was this huge parachute out on his driveway, and on the parachute was the main pilot of the Cessna. After the main pilot had pushed the co-pilot out and leapt out himself, when he pulled his ripcord, his chute either didn't deploy or when it deployed, it didn't inflate fully, and so he was forced to go to his reserve chute, but it didn't inflate fast enough to stop him from crashing into the ground. And so the main pilot slammed into the ground basically at terminal velocity, and so he sustained catastrophic internal injuries, and he died within a couple of minutes of hitting the ground. Fred was so stunned and confused at what he was looking at that without saying a word, he just turned away from his window and walked over to his phone and called the police, shaving cream still on his face. When the police arrived at Fred's house that morning, they were expecting to see a dead recreational skydiver on Fred's property. But when they walked up the driveway and saw the dead man for themselves, they knew right away this was not some recreational skydiver. He actually looked more like a soldier. He was wearing a bulletproof vest over some camouflage fatigues, and he had night vision goggles strapped to his head. But the dead man's shoe choice made the police think this guy could not possibly have been military, because on this guy's feet were not military-style combat boots like you would expect with the rest of his getup. Instead, he was wearing loafers, specifically Gucci loafers, so very expensive designer shoes. And so the police are thinking to themselves, who the heck was this guy, and what was he doing? The police would figure that out. However, first, we have to fast forward 2 months to late November 1985, so roughly 2 weeks before that bear was discovered by that hunter in Chattahoochee National Forest. Now, at this point in late November, that black bear was alive and well and living a typical black bear life in the Chattahoochee National Forest, which meant he mostly spent his time wandering around the woods looking for something to eat. And on this particular day in November, the bear was doing just that when out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something strange lying on the forest floor. It was one of the pieces of luggage that the two pilots had pushed out of their plane. It was this big, heavy duffel bag. Now, the bear had no idea if this duffel bag contained food, but the bear was optimistic, so it meandered its way over and began pawing at the bag with its massive claws, and pretty much immediately, his claws tore open a hole in this bag. And suddenly, the air all around this bear was filled with this glorious, flowery smell. So the bear put its nose directly into this rip in the bag and began sniffing and licking the contents of this bag. And apparently, the bear just loved it because it ate whatever was inside of the bag. All of it. And when he was done, the bear felt so good, he was so full of energy that he just started sprinting in a straight direction. And after running at top speed about 100 yards, every major system inside of this bear shut down all at once and he died on the spot, collapsing in that clearing. And then, about 2 weeks later, that hunter walked into the Chattahoochee National Forest and discovered this dead bear. And then, within 24 hours, the hunter was back home and he told one of his friends about discovering this dead bear. And when he told his friend about seeing this bear, he also kind of casually mentioned that he had seen a duffel bag in the forest not far from this dead bear. Now, to understand what this friend did next, you need some context. By this point in time, the police had actually figured out a lot about that dead man on Fred Myers' driveway, the main pilot of the Cessna. They knew he was a 40-year-old man named Andrew Thornton who had served in the U.S. Army as a paratrooper, but after getting out of the service, he had kind of gone astray in his life and become a big-time smuggler of illegal goods. The police had also figured out by this point that Andrew, along with a co-pilot, had been the people flying that Cessna that eventually was found crashed into a mountainside in North Carolina. The co-pilot had survived the jump out of the Cessna, and so the police tracked him down, and they very quickly realized this co-pilot was really just a victim of Andrew. Andrew had told this guy they were just going to fly to the Bahamas for a vacation. And so when that plan completely evaporated, and suddenly Andrew is barking orders at this guy to open up the plane and push the luggage out and jump out, the co-pilot said he just totally panicked and just started doing whatever Andrew wanted. And so this guy was just totally terrified, and really all he could offer police was just to confirm that, yup, Andrew was the main pilot, and yes, we really did push his luggage out of the side of the plane over some forest in northern Georgia. The police believed the co-pilot and did not charge him with any crime. The police would go and search all over northern Georgia, and they would find the majority of the missing bags. However, they knew they were still missing some, and they knew they really needed to recover them. And so, around the time that this hunter is telling his friend about this bear encounter and this duffel bag, the police were constantly having news outlets tell people in northern Georgia that if you see one of these duffel bags attached to a big parachute or something, please come forward and tell us. We are looking for these. And so the hunter's friend thought, you know what? That duffel bag he mentioned out in Chattahoochee National Forest, which is in northern Georgia, might be one of those bags. And so the friend called authorities. Authorities were thrilled to get this tip, and so they charged out to the Chattahoochee National Forest, and they made their way out to where this dead bear was, and then sure enough, about 100 yards away from this bear was this bag, and it was one of the bags they were missing. Except the bag was empty. Because, as we already know, that black bear had eaten everything inside of this bag. And as you might have guessed, that bag, along with every other bag that had been cast out of the Cessna that night, was full of cocaine. Because Andrew was a drug smuggler. And on the night he and his co-pilot leapt from the Cessna, he was trying to smuggle 900 pounds of cocaine from South America into the United States. That transmission that Andrew and the co-pilot suddenly overheard on their radio as they were cruising along in their Cessna was the sound of federal agents within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency who had been tipped off about Andrew's big drug run, and so they really had sent 2 planes to go follow him and potentially intercept him. And so the authorities standing in the Chattahoochee National Forest looking down at this empty duffel bag had no idea where the cocaine went that was supposed to be inside of it. But on a hunch, they decided to bring the body of the dead black bear back with them and perform an autopsy on it. And sure enough, during this autopsy, the medical examiner would open up the bear's stomach, and the examiner would say the stomach was, quote, packed to the brim with cocaine, thus ending the mystery of how this bear died. It died from a massive, massive cocaine overdose. But the bear story did not end there. Normally, after an animal is autopsied, they are cremated. But for some reason, this medical examiner decided not to do that, and instead, he had the bear taxidermied, and then he gifted this taxidermied bear to the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area. And then from there, the bear changed hands many times. Over the next 2 decades, no one knows exactly who had the bear and for what reason, but there were reports that at least at one point it was stolen from a storage facility, and then it was sold at a pawn shop, and then at some point the bear was in the possession of famous country singer Waylon Jennings, and then finally the bear found its forever home. Today, the bear is on display at the Kentucky Fun Mall in Lexington, Kentucky, and around its neck is a placard that reads, "Cocaine Bear."
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today's podcast features 3 stories that demonstrate that. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Inkling, and it's about a homicide detective who stumbles upon a picture he can't believe is real. The second story you'll hear is called The Nosebleed, and it's about a woman's scary nosebleed that just will not stop after she returns from vacation. And the third and final story you'll hear is called James 3, and it's about a toddler who has this vivid recurring dream, and eventually his parents look into it and they can't believe what they find. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the Follow Button's new waterbed. But instead of using water, use quick-drying cement. Okay, let's get into our first story.
On a Friday afternoon in late August of 2008, a homicide detective in Los Angeles, California, named Kevin Lloyd, grabbed a cup of coffee from the break room and then made his way to his office, and he sat down at his desk. Detective Lloyd had already had a very difficult week, but now he had all this paperwork on his desk that he basically had to go through right now. He had put it off for too long, it was the end of the week, and so today was the day. And so Detective Lloyd took one more sip of coffee and then began sifting through all the papers. Now, this paperwork that Detective Lloyd was charged with going through was really just a huge stack of biographical information about gang members in and around Los Angeles. Basically, any time a gang member got arrested for anything, could be super minor, their information was added to this big dossier of biographical information. And it was the job of the homicide detectives to periodically basically go through all of this information and just kind of make sure you're up to date with what gang members were doing in and around the city. And so this was highly monotonous work, but it was necessary. So Detective Lloyd continued to flip through all these pieces of paper, and as he did, he slammed his cup of coffee, doing his best not to fall asleep from boredom. But after about 30 minutes, Detective Lloyd turned the page, and suddenly something he saw immediately stood out to him. And for about 30 seconds, Detective Lloyd just stared at the paper, having no idea what to make of what he was seeing. And what he was seeing was basic biographical information of a small-time gang member named Anthony Garcia, who had recently been arrested for driving with a suspended license. Now, to this point, many other detectives had seen this document about Anthony Garcia, and they hadn't thought anything of it. But when Detective Lloyd looked at this page about Anthony Garcia, a photo of Anthony immediately stood out to the detective. But before Detective Lloyd was prepared to run to his boss and tell him about this huge discovery he had made, he thought, you know what, I need to do a little bit more digging because this could totally be wrong. So Detective Lloyd left the paperwork on the desk, he put his coffee down, and he walked his way out of the office and down to the room in the police department where they stored all of the files for all the unsolved murder cases. And so Detective Lloyd, he goes in there and he begins walking up and down the rows until finally he found the case that he was looking for. He grabbed it and he walked back to his desk, he sat down, and he began to read it. Now, this unsolved murder case, which was from 4 years ago in 2004, did not appear on the surface to have anything to do with Anthony Garcia. But Detective Lloyd was reasonably sure that there were details in this unsolved murder case from 2004 that would prove his theory about Anthony Garcia. The file that Lloyd was reading described a murder that took place on January 23, 2004. That night, Garcia in person chalked up his tattoo to just some weird depiction of a helicopter killing a peanut guy, and they didn't think too much of it. In the tattoo, lined up with the decorations that were on Mr. Ed's liquor store when John Juarez was murdered in 2004. So really, Anthony Garcia sealed his fate by tattooing that to his chest. Ultimately, Anthony's tattoo would be used to convict him of John Juarez's murder, and Anthony would be sentenced to 65 years to life in prison.
Our next story is called The Nosebleed. On a sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist, who we're going to call Angela Lyons, drove a rented moped through a busy street in Vietnam. Angela had come here about a week earlier from Scotland, where she lived, and so far the trip had been great. She'd been going to nightclubs and partying and eating local food and swimming in local rivers. I mean, all in all, she was having a blast. And now she was just cruising slowly on her moped, looking at all the shops around her and kind of taking in the scenery. And at some point, as she was driving, she turned her head and then she felt her moped hit something really hard, and she actually fell off her bike onto the ground. She hit her head pretty hard, but luckily she was wearing a helmet, and so she was able to stand up and kind of assess that she was physically going to be okay, and she looked and saw what she had run into, and it was actually another moped. And fortunately, the crash was kind of low speed, and so the other moped driver clearly was physically okay as well, and, their mopeds were not actually damaged at all. And so after she said she was sorry, and the two kind of just acknowledged that they were just going to go their separate ways, the other moped driver hopped back on their moped and drove off. And Angela, just to make sure she really was okay here, because again, she hit her head pretty hard on the concrete. And so Angela, she took off her helmet and kind of felt around her scalp, and sure enough, she felt a little bump on her head from where she'd hit the ground, but other than that, she seemed fine. Now, because it was a head injury, albeit a small one, Angela did consider just going to the hospital just to be sure. But, as she felt it a couple more times, she's like, you know what, it's pretty small. This is not a big deal. I'm okay. So she put her helmet back on, got on her moped, and went on about her business. About a week later, Angela was back home in Glasgow, Scotland, and she was inside of her doctor's office about to be examined. Following that moped accident, Angela had stayed in Vietnam for a few more days, and the whole time she had checked that bump on her head every single day, and it had gone away pretty quickly. However, when she landed back home in Scotland, almost right away, she began developing this kind of startling new symptom that she couldn't help but feel must be connected to the moped accident, and it made her really scared, and so she had gone to the doctor. Her new symptom were these sudden kind of extreme nosebleeds, and so she had made an appointment to go see her doctor to figure out what the heck was going on. And so finally, Angela's doctor came into the room, and he would examine her, and he would look at her nose and her head, and he would listen to her story about the moped. But after he was done with the exam, he would tell Angela that he did not think her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped accident. Much more realistically, the nosebleeds were from her body adjusting to the weather in Scotland. Vietnam, it was a very hot environment, and Scotland was very cold, and so that shift was likely causing these nosebleeds. And so the doctor recommended that Angela put some Vaseline inside of her nostrils to keep it moist and just wait for this to clear up as her body transitioned back to Scotland. A few days later, Angela was back home inside of her bathroom looking into a mirror. She was applying some Vaseline to her nostrils. Now, she had been doing this every day, multiple times a day, since the doctor had made that recommendation, but despite following the doctor's orders, her nosebleeds had persisted. If anything, they were getting worse. She was having these things multiple times a day. But for now, Angela simply turned on her shower and waited for the water to warm up, and then she hopped inside. And after a few minutes of just kind of standing under the water, Angela began just kind of touching her nose, something she was doing a lot of, since these nosebleeds had begun. Except as she touched her nose, she began to feel something weird sort of deep inside of her nostril that she maybe hadn't noticed before, and at some point, she actually pushed pretty hard on whatever this was inside of her nasal cavity. And when she did that, it sent this blinding wave of pain over her, and then simultaneously, blood began pouring out of her nose, and she couldn't get it to stop. It was like this flood of just constant bleeding, and it terrified Angela. I mean, she'd had these terrible nosebleeds, but this was the worst one, and it was clearly connected to something inside of her nose. And so she's starting to panic, blood's getting everywhere, and she's thinking, this has gotta be connected to that moped accident. Maybe I have some horrible brain injury. Maybe I'm dying here. And so in a panic, she jumps out of the shower, towels off, gets dressed, and rushes to the nearest hospital. When Angela got to the emergency room, a nurse quickly brought her into an exam room and had her sit down and tilt her head back so the nurse could look into her nostrils to see what was going on. And so Angela, she's got all this gauze to kind of trap the blood, and she's got her head way back, and she's letting the nurse do this exam. And after a while, Angela starts to realize that this exam is taking a really long time. The nurse is just kind of standing there, clearly looking at her nostrils, but not saying anything. And, from Angela's perspective, she can't really see the nurse. Her head is tilted too far back. But the silence that's grown in the room is so loud at this point that Angela finally just kind of sits up and looks at the nurse to see what's going on here. And she sees the nurse is kind of frozen, like she's looking at Angela's nostrils like she can't believe what she's seen. And then the nurse kind of snaps out of it and looks at Angela and says, "Stay calm. I'm gonna get the doctor." And Angela's like, "I am calm. What's going on here?" But then the nurse just turns around and speed walks out of the room. It would turn out Angela's primary care doctor had been right when he said he didn't think her nosebleeds had anything to do with that moped accident. This was not a brain injury or anything connected to the trauma. However, her nosebleeds were connected to something else she had done while in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, in between, going out to nightclubs and partying and trying all that great food, Angela was also swimming in these local rivers. And at one point, when she was in one of those rivers, something found its way into her nose, a 3-inch long, blood-sucking leech. It had been living deep inside of Angela's nostril and sinus cavity for over a week, separated from her brain only by this extremely fragile bone that's only about a 0.5 millimeter thick. Hospital doctors would spend about 30 minutes painstakingly pulling this leech out of Angela's nose, and then once it was out, she would go on to make a full recovery. The next and final story of today's episode is called James 3. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 27th, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leniger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and his wife and his 2-year-old son James had just gotten home from church, and now Bruce was just trying to relax. However, it was proving very difficult to relax because as Bruce is trying to sit on the couch and just kind of close his eyes for a second, his son, James, the 2-year-old, has his toy plane, his favorite toy plane, and he is repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he can, saying, "Plane crash, plane crash, plane crash." And while, of course, James is a kid, he's gonna be loud and noisy and obnoxious, that's what kids do. But for Bruce, he's watching his son do this, and he couldn't help but be really concerned. Because lately, over the past few months, James had become unnaturally fixated, not on planes, but on plane crashes. And even more specifically, James had begun having these recurring nightmares, 4 or 5 times a week, where he'd wake up terrified and he would say James, had just been in a horrible fiery plane crash. And it was every night that was the nightmare. And it was Bruce and his wife didn't even know what to make of this. Where's he getting this from? James was a pretty sheltered kid. He wasn't being exposed to, horrible plane crashes, either in movies or TV shows or books. I mean, he's a 2-year-old. It just made no sense that he was having this recurring nightmare. But what made it even more kind of unsettling is that James wasn't just fixated on the plane crash aspect of this nightmare. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife these weird details about the plane crash, because it was always the same plane crash in his nightmare. He began telling his parents that the Japanese shot me down. And Bruce and his wife are like, what is he referencing? Is this a World War II reference? But again, he's 2. Developmentally, it's not something he would say even if he was exposed to it. It just didn't make any sense. Now, over the past few months that this behavior had really ramped up, Bruce and his wife had taken James to the doctor to say, what's going on here? Like, what's my kid doing? I don't understand any of this. And the doctors were all like, he's a kid. Like, yeah, it's a weird fixation he's got, but he'll grow out of it. Like, don't worry about it. But to Bruce and his wife, it just seemed like James was not growing out of it. He was just getting more and more fixated as time went on. And so as Bruce is sitting there on the couch watching James for the millionth time smash his toy plane into the coffee table and pretend it was this plane crash he couldn't stop thinking about, Bruce decided he had to do something about this. And so over the next couple of months, Bruce, instead of trying to figure out what was wrong with James that was causing him to fixate on this plane crash, instead of doing that, he began sort of like leaning in and asking James to give him more information about whatever he was seeing in his nightmare. Like, give me all the specifics you can possibly recall. And James would eventually let on that it wasn't just the Japanese that shot him down, it was the Japanese military. And also, the type of plane that James was flying in apparently was a Corsair plane. Bruce had never heard of that before, and again, he's looking at his 2-year-old son thinking, how do you even know what a Corsair plane is? But nonetheless, that's what James said. And so Bruce doesn't know what to do with this information, but again, he's just trying to learn. And so in November of that year, Bruce found himself sitting in the living room and he had this World War II coffee table book that he had actually purchased for his father, but he hadn't given it to him yet. And he saw James, playing with his plane, smashing it into the coffee table. And Bruce, he grabs this coffee table book full of pictures of pilots and combat and war, and he flips to pictures of pilots from World War II. Because now, Bruce is thinking maybe my son somehow is imagining a scene from World War II. A pilot has crashed in World War II, the Japanese military shot them down, I don't know. No idea how he got this image, but that could be what he's thinking about. And so he's like, well, maybe I'll just start looking at pictures from World War II of pilots, and maybe somehow or another James will look at this and something will click for him. Bruce really didn't know what he was trying to get out of this, but either way, he called James over and he shows him this book. And he's like, James, do you recognize any of these planes? Like, are any of these planes the Corsair plane that you flew, in your dream? Is any of this stuff sort of lining up with your dream? Again, he's talking to a 2-year-old, but the 2-year-old sort of got it. James looked at the pages, but nothing clicked. James sort of reached down and was just kind of flipping through all the pages, and there was nothing. There was no connection with James. But towards the end of the coffee table book, where Bruce is thinking, like, what am I even doing here? I'm like prompting my 2-year-old to research World War II with me. Like, what is this? What is going on here? But as James is flipping the pages, he suddenly stops and he points at one of the pages and he says to his dad, that's where I was shot down. And he's pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so Bruce, again, he doesn't really know what he's trying to accomplish here, but, clearly his son has pointed out this particular fact that's sort of roughly tied in with the other things he's brought up. He's had this dream about being a pilot who crashes because the Japanese military shot him down. He's highlighting a battle in Japan during World War II where, the Allies were fighting the Axis powers and the Japanese, could have been shooting somebody down. So it sort of made sense. Okay, fine. Maybe my son's dream is about something that happened at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Don't know how this even happens, don't know how this is possible, but I'm going to do some research. And so that's what Bruce does. He begins researching the Battle of Iwo Jima. Doesn't even really know what he's looking for, but he just wants to see if there's anything connected to what his son has been saying. And what he eventually discovers actually is sort of a relief. He discovers that there is no record of any Corsair airplanes crashing during the Battle of Iwo Jima. In fact, no Corsair planes at all were flown during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And his son James had been saying specifically, I flew a Corsair plane. Like, that was the plane that crashed. And so he's thinking, okay, there's a hole in my son's story. Like, he clearly must have latched on to some event somehow. Somebody said it to him, he heard it, whatever it is. And in his 2-year-old mind, he sort of warped it, and that's what he believes happened, but it's not real. Like, he's not actually recalling something that happened in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Like, this is just, a false memory or something. However, Bruce was unable to definitively find the names of pilots who actually flew in the Battle of Iwo Jima. He wanted to find if there was any pilots named James who potentially crashed, during that battle, but he just couldn't find the information. Maybe it existed somewhere, but he couldn't find it. And so Bruce had this idea to get in touch with this old veterans group. all these old guys who had served in the Battle of Iwo Jima that were still alive. They were based out in San Diego, and they got together periodically and just sort of had social hours and stuff like that. And Bruce, he goes out to San Diego, and under false pretenses, he basically tells the group that he's shooting a documentary about the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he needs some information, about certain pilots that flew during the battle. He goes out there, and he goes to one of their social events, and he begins asking around, asking if anybody knew about any pilots named James who were shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And basically all the men he talked to directed him to go talk to the group's historian, this one guy who kind of had all the information about what had happened during this battle. And so Bruce goes over to this guy and he starts asking him questions about, any pilots that, were shot down during the battle, do you know? And the historian, he tells Bruce that, during that battle, virtually no planes were shot down. However, there was one plane that was shot down. A single US Air Force pilot was shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and he was killed. And that pilot's name was James Houston Jr. Bruce couldn't help but be truly shocked that the only pilot shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima happened to be named James. That just seemed like a coincidence that couldn't be possible, considering what his son was saying. And so suddenly, Bruce doesn't know what to make of this information he's been given. For so long, his 2-year-old son, named James, has been talking about how in his dream he's been shot down by the Japanese military during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and now he's being told there was a single pilot shot down in real life during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name was James? How is that possible? That just seems impossible. And so at this point, Bruce is really holding on to the fact that his son had said his plane that he was shot down in was a Corsair plane. And this guy, James Houston Jr., who was shot down, the plane he was shot down in was not a Corsair plane. And so Bruce is telling himself, okay, this is just a crazy coincidence. This didn't somehow happen to my son. He's not channeling somebody else who died years ago. That can't be what's happening here. This is just a wild set of circumstances. That's all this is. But he's freaked out now. And so he calls his wife and he tells her about what he's learned, and he kind of downplays how much this has really unsettled him, but he ultimately tells his wife, and the two of them decide, okay, you know what, let's just do a little bit more research and just figure out what's going on here. This is just so crazy, we gotta do a little bit more research. And in doing research about James Houston Jr., they discover that James has a sister who is still alive. And so they decide to contact her. Not really even sure what they're gonna say, but they figure, you know what, let's just get in touch with her and just tell her what's going on. Who knows? Maybe somehow she can explain this. Who knows? And so kind of on a whim, James and his wife, they send a message to this woman, to the sister. And the sister, when she finds out there's this 2-year-old who's sort of referencing her brother's death in some way, for whatever reason, her reaction was to send actual physical photographs of James Houston Jr. when he was a pilot, when he served in the military. She just sent a whole bunch of pictures to Bruce, his wife, and James to look at. There really wasn't a clear set of what do we do now, and so that's what she did. Here are some pictures. And when Bruce looked at these photos, it was like his whole world was completely rocked. Because in one of the photos that clearly showed James Houston Jr., he is standing in front of a plane. And that plane was a Corsair plane. And so at this point, for Bruce, it felt like the set of circumstances, the coincidences here, were simply too much to ignore. This is no longer coincidence. This is something else. And also, there's one other small detail that now was sort of bubbling up in Bruce's mind, and that was, periodically, his son James would talk about how he really wasn't named James. He was named James III. Just periodically, his son would say that. Not every time, but he brought it up enough that it was sort of a known thing, that he was James III. And now, Bruce is thinking, James Houston Jr.? That's James II. My son? How could he possibly know all these things that happened to James Houston Jr. if he was not James III, James Houston Jr.'s reincarnated soul? Bruce would eventually take his son's story to the news, and the family would film a primetime segment on ABC about it. James was soon invited to the Battle of Iwo Jima Veterans Reunion, where he would shock the group with his knowledge of the battle. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, and when he did, he called her by a nickname that only her late brother ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit had come back to Earth in James III. If reincarnation is real, James's story is one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history. Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/podcastplus to listen with Spotify or another